and pretty likely that there's going to be 800 different plans for education during COVID-19. So when you hear us say throughout the webinar that you really need to be checking your specific district's website for like the most accurate information for your student, that's why. The plans for learning don't have to look the same, and they likely will not.
Next slide, please. So as Jen said, while each school district is responsible for their own plan for educating their students, keep in mind that each school district must still follow the United States Department of Education and New York State Education Department regulations and laws. So keep in mind that existing education law still is in effect, although things may look different. So to see how your district is dealing with the situation, again, please check your own school district's information. Next slide, please. Families should have already been contacted by their school district and informed about their school district's continuity of learning plans. What is continuity of learning? Simply put, it means the continuation of education in the event of a prolonged school closure or school absence, such as we are experiencing now. This means that schools must continue to educate all students during the pandemic, and according to NYSED, when they do so, they must consider the needs of all students and strive to ensure that their plans are equitable and available to all students. Next slide, please.
So distance learning plans can and will vary from district to district, like we already mentioned, but it's important to know that schools within particular districts will also have different learning plans. Different learning plans are going to depend upon the student's age and grade levels.
Wow.
Schools are open, you don't really teach a second grader the same way that you would teach an 8th grader, and it's not going to be any different when schools are closed. So depending on grade level and the student, or the age of the student, things are going to look different. Some examples of learning plans we've seen are virtual classrooms, phone calls from teachers that accompany packets of work that are sent home for students to work with, and computer-based learning. Next slide, please. If parents are confused about the learning plan for their child, or if they don't understand like what it is, they should be contacting their schools immediately. We would advise that you try contacting individual teachers first. Everyone's accessible via email right now. It's probably the best way to reach everyone. Your school websites will have email addresses listed for all staff and administrators. So if you're a teacher and the information you get isn't helpful, certainly ask for further clarification, or at that point you can try reaching out to the school principal.
Next slide, please. Remember, whatever the plan the school district chooses, it must be accessible to all of their students. So that's a big takeaway. So what happens, what does it mean? What happens if it's not? What if a school district, for example, uses computer-based learning or written packets or video instruction, and for whatever reason, it's not effective for your particular student? If this happens, then the school district must provide the student with an effective alternative means or method to access the curriculum. This could be done through supplements or written packets, modifications, alternative means such as not using a computer, or phone calls. Those are just some examples. But remember, parents need to contact the school district if a student is not being provided with an effective way to access the curriculum. Next slide, please. Okay, so many school districts are using devices such as computers, Chromebooks, iPads, etc., to provide their remote learning. These devices can be needed for class notes, class lessons, classwork, homework, assignments, virtual lessons. But what happens if a student doesn't have a device? This seems to be a big problem in some districts. If this is the case, the parent needs to contact the school district immediately. When they call the school, they should ask the district to provide the device. That's the first line of defense. Please give me a device so that my child can access the curriculum. If the response is that there are no devices available, then the parent needs to advocate for another method to educate this child that doesn't require a device. So the takeaway I think you're going to hear say a lot is communication is the key, and that school districts have a responsibility to make sure all their kids are getting educated. So if there's no device, the school district has to do something. They can't just say, sorry, I don't have a device, I don't know what to do. The other thing to keep in mind is that what happens if a family has a device, but they don't know how to use it correctly? NYSERD requires school district to provide supporting systems, orientation, and preparation. So if you are having trouble using the learning system, contact the school district and ask for support. Next slide, please. Often, when there is a device, there is a need for internet service. If there is a barrier because the family has no internet or they have weak internet, parents should contact the school district and ask them to assist in providing internet access.
So some solutions that school districts on Long Island have been using for the internet problem, some schools are providing hotspot devices for individual families so that multiple people in one house can have the internet. Some districts have been providing hotspots on school buses and placing those buses at bus stops so that multiple families within a neighborhood can access the internet. And then a lot of districts are referring families to local internet providers who have been offering free internet services during the pandemic.
But remember, if a student cannot access their education because they have no internet, the school district must provide another way to educate the student. Next slide, please. Okay, so what about students with disabilities? NYSERD requires that a school district's remote plan must give students with disabilities, and that includes English language learners with disabilities, one, equal access to education, and that their plan must provide an educational benefit to the student with the disability that is comparable to students without disabilities. So what does this mean? This means that FAPE, a free, appropriate public education, must still be provided, or in other words, school districts must still provide IEP and 5.0 plan services. Next slide, please. So how do you provide FAPE given the situation that we're now dealing with? In order to provide FAPE, the school district remote learning plans for students with disabilities must still be individualized. That's a key component of FAPE, and it still is true. So the school can't just say, this is our plan, make it work. They have to individualize it for each student. They also must modify, when necessary, to include aids and services so that the student with the disability can have equal access to the curriculum. And the distance learning plans must provide enough services so that the student can make progress towards their IEP goals. Those standards are still in effect. Next slide, please.
Hi, babe. Hi, what you need? I'm right here. Look, girl.
Again, parents need to, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, I'm going to continue. I'll assume if you can't, you'll put it in the chat. The key, again, is communication. So parents need to communicate. And when I say communicate, I mean in writing, because often schools you can't prove that you made the communication unless it's in writing. So by email or some other writing. The parents need to communicate the needs of the students and to request modifications needed to implement the IEP. Again, if the way the school district is providing remote education, i.e. using technology, or when the educational materials are not available in an accessible form, then you must ask the school district to provide effective alternatives. Some examples of effective alternatives that have been provided by the guidances are maybe giving extra time for assignments, closed captioning on video lectures, access to print materials, virtual psychological services, virtual speech and language services, and those are just some examples. But keep in mind that the school district doesn't have to amend the IEP when they implement their remote learning plans. Next slide, please. We should be up to related services. Next slide, please. Nope, go back one. Sorry. There you go. Perfect. So what about related services? Related services on the IEP must still be provided to students during distance learning to the best of the district's ability. It may not look the same, but the schools still need to make their best efforts to provide what related services exist on the IEP. This means, for example, they could use teletherapy or teleintervention, but only when it's possible and when it can preserve privacy. By the way, keep in mind that teletherapy and teleintervention can also be used for English language learner and bilingual services, which we'll talk about a little later. School districts don't have to amend the IEPs for related services either. It's the same service, just a different mode of delivery. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a big piece of what's going on. What happens if a student does not receive the services that are on the IEP, whether they're related services or basic services? Parents should request that the district provide the service as soon as possible. So the first ask from a parent is, I'm not getting what's on my IEP, can you work with me? And that's the big key. Communicate with the district and work together to try and make sure that the child is getting as much as they can that's on the IEP that's consistent with remote learning. If the school district can't figure out with the parent a way to provide that service remotely, for whatever reason, then eventually the IEP team or the 504 team will have to make an individualized determination regarding what compensatory services will be needed for the student to catch up. So they want to catch up on the skills that they would have had if they had received the appropriate services. This is replete with questions. There's lots of unknowns, and it's going to be a big area as we move forward. But some of the questions are, services were provided. A parent might say, well, services were provided, but the quality was lacking. For example, a parent might be getting some exercises from a physical therapist, but because the parent's not a physical therapist, they're not really sure how to do those exercises, so they were ineffective. So that's one area where you're going to have a problem or a concern that you have to deal with down the road. Or a service can't be provided remotely for whatever reason. If it's therapy and the psychologist wants to preserve privacy and there's no quiet place for the child to work with the therapist, that may put an end to a remote therapy session. So for each particular child, it has to be looked at. These are going to be issues that come up. And as things change, this may also change. One idea I heard was as things start to open up, the question of could we provide some compensatory services of physical therapy in an outside field, keeping kids separate and having the PT lead the exercises. So there's some creative thinking going into this. We don't really know what it's going to look like, but you're going to have to communicate with your school and work together to try to figure out how to make sure that the student catches up and gets what they're entitled to. The other big question that I don't have the answer to is how much is going to be needed to make up for lost sessions. So if you lost 3 months of sessions, how much do you need? And how do you implement that come the new year, even if we're back in school? Students are hard-pressed to want to go to a full day of school and then do 3 hours of compensatory services after. So I'm just raising these questions. I don't know the answers, and I do know these are all things that lawyers and advocates are talking about. So just we have some caution that could help you going forward. And what we're thinking is what we're learning is that parents are going to need to document both or either that the services were not provided and that skills were lost during the school district's failure to provide the services. Next slide, please. So what does this look like? Parents are going to have to document the present levels of educational performance, and they're going to have to document the progress or lack of progress that their student made, in order to make a claim for compensatory services. Some thoughts about how you can do this. A parent can keep a log and should be keeping a log of whatever service they're getting so that they have dates and times and duration of the services that are being provided. They might want to videotape their child like at the beginning. It's already too late. We can't videotape March if we didn't, but videotape them now and then videotape them in September and compare the skills that they had maybe now that they don't have in September, and that could prove regression or prove that they stagnated and didn't make progress. So that's one way. You can look at progress reports from earlier in the school year to document a baseline for where the child was when school closed and then compare that to where they are now. And you can use samples of child's work and compare dates from earlier dates to current dates. And those are just some ideas of ways you can document the situation so that when it comes time to request compensatory services, you have some data to use to do that. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Okay, so,
Okay, thank you.
next one.
Next one.
Oh, go, you want to go? Yeah, go to the next one, Fong, please.
Evaluate.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
So can schools do evaluations while they're closed? So the short answer is yes, but there's a lot of buts. So districts can conduct evaluations while schools are closed if the evaluations do not require face-to-face or in-person interactions or observations. That being said, just because schools can do them, schools are not required to do them during school closure. The other piece is that if the district wants to move forward with an evaluation during school closure, they still need the parent to consent to that evaluation. If an evaluation does require face-to-face or interpersonal interaction, the evaluation must wait until New York State provides updated guidance on social distancing and what that can look like. Next slide, please. So I know this is a big time for annual reviews, and sometimes when you have an annual review, your school will have completed, like, updated evaluations or assessments that they're going to review at your child's annual review. And sometimes they don't have updated assessments. The CSE can review a student's existing evaluation data, they can review a student's yearly progress, and they can also look at their current levels of performance when they're making recommendations for the student's IEP program and services for the next school year. Annual reviews that are taking place while schools are closed, they're going to be in a sense where there's probably not going to be any new evaluation or assessments to review or consider when they're making recommendations for next year. And that's okay. That's always been okay. That being said, if a parent's participating in their child's annual review and they believe that a new evaluation or that updated evaluations are necessary, they still have the right to request additional evaluations. That request should probably be expressed during the meeting, but it also must be put into writing to the school district after the meeting. Keep in mind, though, like I said before, that any new evaluations that parents are requesting, if they require face-to-face or in-person interaction, those evaluations have to wait until schools are able to conduct them. And again, that's going to be dependent upon updated guidance from New York State in terms of social distancing. Next slide, please. So New York State has canceled all Regents exams for June and August of 2020. And as many of you know, students do need to pass a certain number of Regents exams and specific Regents exams to graduate high school with a New York State Regents diploma. So what do the Regents cancellations mean for students? Next slide, please. So any 7th through 12th grade student is going to be permanently exempt from any Regents exams they were scheduled to take in June or August of 2020 if they pass the Regents course that's associated with that Regents exam during this current 2019-2020 school year, or in August of 2020 if they take that course in some sort of a summer program. The next group of students who are going to be permanently exempt are students who are in 7th through 12th grade who have passed a Regents course in earlier school years, but they either failed the exam or they never sat for the Regents exam. Those students will also be permanently exempt from the Regents if they were considered planning to take the Regents exam. Next slide, please. So who's considered to be planning to take the exam? Again, any student who is currently enrolled in a Regents course for the 2019-2020 school year that culminates with a Regents exam, they are planning to take the exam and they will be permanently exempt. Any student who is receiving academic intervention services, supplemental instruction, and or tutoring within the school setting to prepare for a June 2020 Regents exam, they too are permanently exempt from that Regents. And again, it's this last group of students that we need to pay close attention to. Students who have previously passed a Regents course in a different school year, but either failed that Regents exam or never sat for the Regents exam, they have to inform the school that they were planning to take the exam. Some school districts have been pretty lenient and sort of just assuming that those students were going to be taking the exam. Some districts have allowed students to just have a verbal conversation with them to say, oh yeah, I was planning to take that, and then those students are now exempt. But really, if you're not sure if your student is considered someone who is planning to take the exam, parents should put that in writing as soon as possible and send it into their school district. Next slide, please. So the Regents exam exemptions affect transcripts, but not in any sort of negative way. Any Regents exam that students are exempt from due to COVID-19, those Regents exams are going to be listed on students' official transcripts. However, those exams obviously will not list a score. There should just be some sort of designation that says COVID-19 exemption or exempt. A COVID-19 exemption next to a Regents exam does not affect anyone's individual determinations for a student who's trying to earn an honors or an advanced Regents diploma. Now, honors or advanced Regents diplomas usually require an additional number of Regents exams and specific scores on your Regents exams. So if you have exemptions for exams that typically require a higher score, that's not going to hurt you in trying to earn that advanced or honors diploma. Students who are exempt from Regents exams this year due to COVID-19 are also going to be exempt from the corresponding subtask on their task, which is the test assessing secondary completion, formerly known as the GED. So if you have a student who, for whatever reason, chooses not to graduate high school but wants to take the task after their cohort has graduated, if they were, let's say, exempt this year from the English Regents, they were also going to be exempt from the English subtest on the task when they do take that exam. Next slide, please. All right, so just some tips for parents attending and participating in virtual CSE meetings. Next slide. So things are going to look very different, mostly because no one's sitting at the same table in a school building. People are showing up wearing hoodies and pajamas. Everyone's got their hair in a crazy bun. But aside from that, CSE meetings and the requirements for school districts are exactly the same. So schools are still required to provide at least 5 days notice of the CSE meeting. I would advise parents that if you have changed your email address, if you've changed your cell phone number, if you have moved, if you've changed any contact information, be proactive and reach out to the school district so that they know how to get in touch with you and where to send you notice. When parents are contacted by their schools and they're alerted as to when their meeting is going to be, as always, parents do have the right to request a different date and time for their meeting. Parents always have the right to have meetings scheduled at a time that is mutually convenient and agreeable for both themselves and the school district. All CSE meetings are still being held on the required timelines, and the same committee members are required to participate as if we would be participating like in in-person meetings. So again, the only difference with CSE meetings is that they're going to be conducted on a phone call or a video call and not in person. Next slide, please. So I guess no matter how hard we tried to be a William, and for this webinar we ended up being a Winston because we couldn't figure things out. And that's okay. Everyone's going to be their own virtual person, but I just thought this was amusing, way more amusing before this happened to us like a half an hour ago. So next slide. So it seems silly, but I would really recommend practicing with your friends or family before you
contact this week.
There's background noise.
Yeah, there's still some people who aren't muted. If you could mute your mics, please.
Okay. So definitely practice with friends or family before the meeting. I was all ready to tell you about our practice session 2 days ago, that it took us about an hour and a half to connect to the technology, and I was planning to say, thank God that we did that, because things were supposed to be running smoothly today, but it didn't matter that we spent 2 hours practicing 2 days ago. It still took us a really long time to figure it out today, and we still aren't doing it how we wanted to do it. So there are some specific things I would suggest testing out before you get on your meeting. Learn how to mute or unmute yourself. Sometimes people mutter under their breaths. If you are a mutterer, like I can sometimes be, you might want to mute yourself. Sometimes you have things going on in the background that you don't want other people to hear. Your dog's barking, the kids are fighting, your other phones are ringing, whatever it is, just make sure you know how to mute yourself and unmute yourself.
And just, excuse me, Jen, but just I wanted to make the point that parents' meaningful participation in the CSE meeting is a huge issue under the law. And so making sure that the committee can hear you and you know how to work your mic and that you have access to be heard is going to be an important component of that.
Also, make sure you know how to turn your camera on and off. Again, sometimes we want to be seen, sometimes we don't want to be seen. And there's also different ways for you to be able to view all of the people who are participating in the meeting. There's what's called a speaker view, which allows you to see only the person who is speaking at that moment. You'll get a big picture of them on your screen. Or you get a gallery view, which allows you to see all the meeting participants, like the Brady Bunch style, like in tiles across your screen. So just be comfortable with the technology before it's time for you to actually use it. Next slide. So how do we avoid being this guy? Because I do like Tom Cruise, but you never want to be the person who's screaming, "Can you hear me now?" Next slide.
I love you.
So the day of the meeting, you want to make sure that your phone or your device is fully charged. If you're using a cell phone, you might want to check your Wi-Fi connection, or your cell service, sorry. If you're using a computer or a tablet, check your Wi-Fi connection. Make sure you have a space that you find comfortable for yourself. Give yourself enough room to take notes, have a pen and paper, and if you have questions or concerns going into the meeting, I would definitely recommend like having that written out ahead of time and placing it near you so that when you're in the meeting, you can ask whatever questions you have. Absolutely, even though you're not in person and you're not with all these people, I would still treat it like you were and participate as you would any other kind of meeting. Next slide, please. So you need to get ready for the camera. I would suggest making sure that you understand how your camera direction is facing. Sometimes laptops have a camera that faces the person. Sometimes their camera has a back-sided, or sometimes their laptop has a back-sided camera. You want to make sure the camera is facing you and not what's in front of you. Otherwise, people might just be staring at a wall. If the camera is facing the correct way towards you, make sure there's no distractions behind you. Make sure you have good lighting. You want to be able to see the people that you're going to be speaking with, and they're going to want to see you. So this is a big thing. It's really awkward. I always forget that people are looking at me on these video calls, even when I'm not speaking, because I feel like when you're in person, unless you're the person talking, no one's looking at you. I've learned pretty quickly that everyone's looking at you all of the time. I eye roll constantly, I flip my hair, and I have pretty expressive faces, and I don't realize they're happening. I'm getting a lot of questions as to what I'm thinking. What are my questions? Why am I making that face? Stop flipping your hair. Do you know we can see you? So don't be me. Follow my advice. So that would be my suggestion for you. And remember, you're not the only one who's never done this before. It's new for everybody. Parents keep joining these virtual CSE meetings, and I'm attending with them and apologizing to the school district that they've never done this before and they're not sure if their camera's right. And so far, I've been very happy to see that school districts have been really supportive and helpful for parents, encouraging them to use the technology, letting them know that they're doing fine, and really just reiterating that it's new for them as well. Next slide, please.
Okay, so switching gears a little, I want to talk about grading and course credit during these closures. Keep in mind that students will be graded for remote work. And again, I'm going to caution everybody, check with your district. This is a very district-sensitive issue. But the general prospect is that students will be graded for their remote work, like their quizzes and their exams, just as if the schools were open. Virtual work can be monitored by teachers. Students might think that they're not being monitored, but when work is done virtually, such as in Google Classrooms, teachers can see how often and for how long students log in, which could be used in the student's attendance or participation grade. All students, and this is our recommendation, all students should be participating in their remote learning. And if a student is struggling, contact the teacher and ask for help. Because remember, in order to pass the class, the student will need to have demonstrated that they met the standards assessed for the course. And keep in mind again that each district has discretion, but so does each school, each teacher, each principal, and there's going to be a lot of discrepancies between the way things are done, and you as a parent should know what is being done to address whether or not your child has met the standards for the class to get the pass. And that pass may have a huge implication because you can't get the exemption for the Regents if you haven't passed the class. So specifically for Regents kids, we really want them to be participating in the remote learning. Next slide, please.
So the CDOS stands for Career Development and Occupational Studies. It's a commencement credential that some secondary students work towards. So any student who has been working towards earning their CDOS credential and is scheduled to graduate or complete high school in June of 2020 will still be awarded their CDOS credential if they've completed and fulfilled all of their other CDOS requirements up until the time schools closed down in March of 2020. All CDOS programs include different CDOS assessments. Any student who is scheduled to, again, graduate or complete high school in June of 2020 is exempt from any CDOS assessment they were scheduled to take during the spring semester of 2020. So that will not affect their ability to earn their credential. Now, any student, regardless of whether or not they're graduating, who is working towards a CDOS credential is exempt from any required credits or hours that they should have earned during the spring semester of 2020. They also will be exempt from any CDOS assessments they were scheduled to take for this semester only. Students will not have to make up credits or hours in future school years to compensate for what they did not earn this semester. Students who are not scheduled to graduate or complete high school in June are only exempt from the credits, hours, and their CDOS assessments for the spring 2020 semester only. They are still required to earn the appropriate credits and hours and pass any future CDOS assessments in coming school years.
Again, I'm just going to say that's the status right now. That may change as the decision about next year changes. Stay tuned. I also want to just go back. I am up to English language learners, but I wanted to mention back on the grading slide that if a student is not passing and it's because of a failure of a school to provide appropriate, like a computer or appropriate means to participate, a parent should make that known to the school and appeal the failure, because it's not fair, obviously, for a child to fail when they didn't have access to the curriculum, which is what the laws require. I meant to say that earlier, sorry. So we can go ahead to English language learners, which there has not been a lot of guidance about, which is sad because this is a huge group of students that I'm sure are struggling. However, there is guidance that says school districts must provide some targeted instruction in English and appropriate supports in the home language. And again, our advice is if that's not happening, contact your school district and request it. And I'm not sure what it looks like, and I'm not sure whether schools are doing it, but that is the standard. The other point that families need to know is that all information coming out of the school should be provided in your native language. That's a law that's been in existence and that hasn't changed. So families can't access a remote curriculum if they're not getting information in their native language. So that's another avenue for advocacy and for parents. Next slide, please.
So New York State has issued guidance and some requirement for school districts in terms of food distribution. So the requirement is that schools must provide meals to low-income children and families during school closures that are related to COVID-19. Their guidance is that they're encouraged to develop a plan that best meets the needs of those in their community. And that's it. How districts meet that one requirement and follow that one piece of guidance is, again, at every district's discretion. Please check your district's website for specific information regarding the provision of meals. Some districts have different methods for delivery of meals or picking up meals. Some districts have different locations within their district. One day it's this school, the next day it's a different school to pick it up at. Some districts are offering it 3 days a week. Some are offering it 5 days a week. Some are doing it in the morning. Some are doing it in the afternoon. It's going to be different for district to district, so please check your district website if you are looking for this information.
And my information, and this may be changing, but as I understand it, food distribution, is going to continue throughout the summer. So just because the school year is ending, my understanding is that they are still going to be distributing food.
Next slide.
Next slide. Okay, so these are our contact information. We're trying to keep everything up to date. We're happy to answer questions. I understand that the webinar and some links will be provided. Ann?
Terrific. Yes, thank you so much, Jen and Eileen. I really, really appreciate the time that you spent today. And we have a lot of questions, so I'm not going to say too much. I just want to let people know there are some resources that you can actually link to once these slides are posted, and they will be posted within a couple of days. We're also going to put up with the slides a list of other educational advocacy centers throughout the state that are similar to LIAC, so that if you have a question, you know how to reach those people. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Susan Berger from Families Together. We've worked together with Families Together to produce this and many other webinars. And Susan is going to moderate some of your questions now.
Okay.
Susan, if you're talking, we'll need to unmute.
Oh, yeah.
Eileen and Jen, are you able to hear me? This is Ann.
Yes. Yes.
We're not able to hear Susan for some reason. So I'm going to get myself onto the list of questions.
Is that better? Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, there you are. Okay, go ahead, Susan.
Oh, that's weird. Okay. So thanks to Jen and Eileen, and I'm going to get right to the questions. There's one question about resources, and Ann answered some of that just before when she was talking about resources. And also there's a resource I'd like to bring up in terms of what other services might be available to people across the state and how they might be able to connect to what's available in their area. In each of the regions across the state, Families Together in New York State has parent advisors. We're going to put a link in the chat box, so you'll be able to go to the Families Together website, and you'll be able to access the information for the parent advisor that's closest to your area. So it's a great opportunity to get some information and also to link to family peer support services if that's something that you think you're a family member and you feel you would benefit from, or you think that somebody that you're working with would benefit from. So I'm going to get to the other questions. There's a question here, and I think this relates to the grouping of slides that have to do with technology. Somebody asked who in the district should be contacted, and they want to know, should they contact the principal, special needs coordinator, or the superintendent, or who else would be the best contact person. So I'm going to ask Eileen if she could just speak to that for a minute.
I'm going to respond to Jen. She has the answer.
I was already
okay.
answering that. It depends on the district. If I'm assuming we're talking about the technology required to access the education. Is that your understanding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that differs from district to district. Most school districts, and again, I'm only on Long Island, but most districts on their home web page, not even a school specific, there's a giant banner running across it or something in big red letters that says COVID-19 updates or information. More often than not, I think every single time I've looked on a particular district site, that's where I found all the information related to how to pick up technology and how to access it.
Great. Thanks, Jen. And the next question, I work at a school that is an out-of-district placement. So this, of course, is a concern because that means we have to follow districts' different learning plans, or do we, as an 853 school, develop our own plan?
Okay, so I'm going to...
Either of you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is Eileen. I'm going to plead ignorance. I don't know what an 853 school is. I'm assuming it's not something from Long Island. So I would say you need to coordinate with your home district and the building that's providing the service, so the out-of-district placement. They need to coordinate together to make sure that the remote plan is working for your student. Does that answer the question?
I think so.
So the 850 schools, they're the New York State approved like private day programs. Is that?
Does that change the answer?
Well,
So
I
we
don't
just
know.
had a message in the chat box that says that an 853 school is an out-of-district school that serves special education students. Hang on a second. The chat box scrolled away from me here because serves special education students from various school districts throughout their region.
Right. So it's
So it
sort
sounds
of
like, yeah.
type of program or like any other kind of out of district program. So from what I have seen, educators with BOCES programs in particular still have to follow the student's IEP as directed by their school district, but the district has to be the one to provide like the technology and the direction to the school, like the 853 school, as to how they should be implementing those services or that student's program, if that clarified that at all.
Yeah, again, the best advice is communication, and in that situation, communicate with both schools.
Thanks. Next question is, are there talks, or have you heard about any talks for September about the need to standardize distant learning? And for example, all schools have to offer actual recorded or live lessons to their students rather than just have them do worksheets and learn from websites or Zoom. So I guess the question really focuses on standardization.
Yeah.
And have you heard anything about that for September?
So I've been on many calls with many different people, and it's all over the place right now. And all I'm hearing is that, yeah, we're going to have to talk about that. Yeah, we're going to have to talk about that. That's going to be on the agenda to figure out over the summer. So I know that districts and superintendents are asking those questions. My advocacy hat says that parents should weigh in if they can on what works for them. I've heard good advice from some attorneys who say that parents should take note of what's been working, and maybe what parents need to think about is in the event that we do use a remote learning plan in the future, because it's possible that they'll start and then they'll close again, that they work that into an IEP. If they have a CSE meeting, they say, okay, if we're in school, this works, but if we're on remote learning, I need this. But every conversation I'm in has every idea is being considered, and it's all over the board.
So I guess we'll have to wait and see. Next question is, will you be able to, can you address the continuity of learning during extended school year for disabled students? One of the districts we work with, and this is also a question from an 853 school, has not approved extended year learning for any of their students enrolled in our program, although, you know, some districts have. So is there any advice you can give them about, you know, kind of what they should do?
So this is completely off the top of my head. I haven't heard any guidance and seen any guidance on this specifically, but extended school year is supposed to be provided when a child has regressed or there's an anticipation that the child will regress. Go ahead.
Or I just want to throw in that there are some programs that require, that are 12-month programs. So if a student's going to attend that school, the district is required to provide the extended school year services almost automatically. They can't attend the school if they're not a 12-month student.
So if it's a complete violation, if you already have it on your IEP, I would recommend you contact your regional associate and get advice there, and also be taking data and use it for compensatory ed. My guess is that state ed is not going to say, yes, a district can just refuse to do extended school year, but I don't know that for a fact, and that's why I'm going to refer you to your regional associate and try and get guidance specific to that specific district. And the remedy, as I can think of off the top of my head, would be comp ed going forward. But I agree that that's not a good enough solution.
Mm-hmm. And comp ed is compensatory education?
Yeah. Sorry. So
Okay.
then document the loss and then ask the district to make it up. But in the life of a child, I'm fully aware that you lose a summer, there's no real good way to make that up. And the child's going to be behind. So that's going to be a problem.
Here's another kind of general question that someone has, and they're looking for, I guess, advice here. So how does this look for a second grader that needs aid for, that needs an aid for support in the school and really can't be left alone on a Zoom call or completing any work that they have? But the parent, although working from home, is, working a very long day, has a very demanding position, and can't sit with the child. So what happens in a situation like that?
So, Susan, that's a good example of what I was talking about, in that the remote learning plan from the district doesn't work for a particular child, so that particular child can't access their education during using the remote plan that the school is providing. So the parent needs to advocate to the school to do more. They need to have a teacher or an aide call in and work through it with the child individually, or whatever the child needs. It still should be driven by the individual needs of the child. And the school should be made aware that the situation isn't giving the child access to the curriculum. And I understand that the school may say, well, parent, that's your job. And the parent should say, I can't. And these are the areas that are very complicated and very uncertain. But as a lawyer, I would say that's what I'd be advocating for, and say, sorry, school district, you need to step up and individualize. And unfortunately, cases like this may end up in hearings, because there might be an argument for denial of FAPE in a due process hearing down the road. Or you can file due process now if you, even though they're still going forward. So it may become that contentious if, they just dig their heels in, the school district. But I would say communicate with the district, try to work out a plan that works so that this second grader can get what they need. And it's kind of ridiculous to expect a second grader, in my opinion, that needed an aide in a classroom to sit on a Zoom call all by themselves and learn. That just doesn't sound reasonable.
Yeah. And that's just generally good information for any grade or any student that's not really able to access, the learning the way it's being done now, like the remote learning.
Right.
So here's a question about timing. If a child is owed tutoring, how long should the family wait to contact the school?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand the question. Owed tutoring from prior suspension? Like what kind of owed tutoring?
That's not clear in the question, but I guess the larger question is, when the family feels like they have a service that they're not getting or didn't get, how long should they wait to contact the school? Is there, a time frame that you would recommend?
I would say any need that's not being met should be communicated immediately in writing and documented. If the question is referring to a situation where the child needs a face-to-face service that can't be provided, at least by communicating in writing that they're not getting it, you're documenting the need for it and the failure of the school to provide it, so that when the restrictions are lifted and face-to-face can happen, that's when you would make a move for them to start to give you the compensatory time. But I would say immediate communication in any issue is my recommendation. And keep a copy. If you make a writing, make sure you have a copy and you keep a paper trail so that you have a file. And when you go in and you want to claim that your child is owed something, you have the documents to prove it.
And this question also, it appears from the question that a school is urging a family or a student to, what happened to that? Oh, I'm sorry, that question kind of just disappeared. Oh, here it is. What if a school is urging to close a student's special education file and open at a later date? So I guess because of what's going on, they're encouraging the student to close their file and then reopen it.
I would say no, bad idea. If a child is an IEP and a district is trying to argue that a child no longer has a disability because the schools are closed, because that just sounds like a convenient excuse for a school not to provide services, I would never recommend a parent agree to close a file or withdraw their request for special education. And keep in mind that by law, they can't take away special education services without new evaluations. So what is that based on? If there's some evaluative data that proves the child doesn't need it anymore, but that doesn't sound like what this question is saying. It sounds like they're just saying, no special ed while the school's closed, we'll pick it up again when school opens, and that's not consistent with law.
Although I interpret that question slightly differently, and I could be wrong, but Eileen covered it a little bit. It a little bit sounded to me as if a parent had referred their child for initial evaluations for special ed services, and in the middle of that initial 60-day window that school districts have, schools sort of shut down, and now schools might be asking the parent to withdraw that referral to CSE until schools are reopened. If that is the case, I would not advise parents to withdraw their referrals. Schools are not, they're still held to a 60-day timeline, but any day that school is closed due to COVID-19 is not included in those 60 days. So the withdrawal, or schools asking parents to withdraw, so it doesn't make any sense for parents to do that. They can just keep the referral open. Schools aren't going to be penalized for not conducting the initial evaluations within 60 calendar days like they typically would be. That's not the expectation.
So, we're just covering it on both sides. It's unclear, which of those scenarios is going on here, but now we have it covered on both. I'm going to do maybe one more question. Maybe we'll get in two, but there are a lot more questions here, so maybe we'll be able to get the questions answered if your question hasn't been answered, and then we can post that with the rest of the with when the slides come out and the recording. So we can just post this with some resources. So, if you're looking for answers or you want this document, it will be able to post it. So the last question is, if a child with a disability maintains developmental skills during the school closures but fails to make additional progress during that time, is the child entitled to compensatory education?
Okay, that's a $10 million question. And even Jen and I are sitting here rolling our eyes, not necessarily agreeing. My understanding is that the schools are still required to give services to allow the child to make progress toward their IEP goals. So as I understand that question, I would answer yes. I would make a claim for compensatory services on the grounds that they weren't fulfilling their IEP promise to give the child services to achieve their goals. However, it's a very gray area, and it may be litigated as we move forward, but I would encourage a parent to keep that data and to make the argument with whatever evaluative information they can provide to show that the child didn't progress and therefore the school district failed to provide FAPE. I mean, that's basically the argument. My guess is that it's going to be very hard to prove and that you may want to work with your district to get whatever they're willing. My conversations locally with lawyers around Long Island are that they're fully expecting these comp ed claims, and they don't want to litigate 200 million due process hearings on this. So schools might be, and I don't know about the area this question comes from, but schools might be more willing to work with parents towards a satisfying solution. So I would say make the claim and try your best to prove that you did not get the services to provide FAPE.
Yeah, I initially had a little bit of a different take on that, but I'm rethinking it while Eileen was speaking, and I agree with her.
Thank you. Oh, great. I'm gonna. So we're not going to be able to answer any more questions right now. I'm going to pass this back to Anne, if she's able to get on and close out the webinar.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Jen and Eileen, and from the Long Island Advocacy Center, and Susan Berger from Families Together in New York State. Thank you to everyone who chatted in questions, and we will try to post some resources to help you address those questions or to link up with advocates in your area who have similar expertise. It's reassuring to hear from Eileen and Jen that all the advocates and lawyers are talking to each other about how to hopefully, help students and families get what they need. I see a lot of questions looking at some, really frustrating situations where families are in difficulty at home trying to support kids and work at the same time. They might live in rural areas where the school is suggesting they could do homework in the car, which as a parent, I kind of laughed at when I saw that. I thought, wow, there are so many different things going on. What you can do to help us shape future offerings on this important topic is when this webinar closes out, you'll receive an invitation to participate in a survey about the webinar. Please provide us with some feedback about today's webinar, and also use that opportunity to let us know what topics in general, maybe not so much specific questions, but what topics within this question of education during COVID-19 you'd like to see some additional resources provided for. So with that, I want to thank everyone, and I hope everyone has a nice weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.